My name is Charles Ross. I'm a senior tech editor with The Economist. Before I introduce the rest of my esteemed panelists, I just want to get, for the rest of the people here in the room, a bit of an indication of who we're speaking to here. So could you put your hands up for me if you are an entrepreneur here in the room with us today? How many entrepreneurs do we have here? We have a pretty good number there. It's not, probably maybe a third of the room. Something like that. And your hand up again if you've started your business in the last 10 years. Business has been started in the last 10 years. Excellent. Now, I personally consider you guys and girls to be the lucky ones, to be the lucky entrepreneurs, because, and I have a bit of experience in saying that answer, because I was an entrepreneur myself, and I started up my own business way back in the year 2000, 16 years ago, long time ago. And the environment for entrepreneurs then was very, very different from what it is today. The access to information, the access to networks, the sort of things like social media didn't really exist, accelerators, incubators, all this sort of stuff didn't really exist. And you've all got that, access to that here today. So I think it's fantastic, very lucky. So if we roll forward to where we are today, what we wanted to do at The Economist is to do some research, to understand the value that some of these new trends, new developments in the ecosystems is bringing to entrepreneurs. So we did a large piece of research. We spoke to entrepreneurs from 10 cities around the world to understand a bit more about these new technologies and these new, mostly informal activities which entrepreneurs are drawing on and the value that they're going to bring to entrepreneurs. And so the sort of informal activities and the formal communities that I'm talking about here that have developed online networking tools such as Facebook and LinkedIn, which is, according to our research, one of the most used tools by all entrepreneurs, as well as face-to-face networking, which isn't new, but the platforms that exist, like meetups, are new, and they're making them much more powerful for entrepreneurs, easier to access, and really aiding the proliferation of those types of activities. Those are the major initiatives, activities, which entrepreneurs are leading on these days for knowledge and information. So really exciting developments within the ecosystem. And so on our panel today, I've got a diverse group of people from different cities, because what we're seeing is all these different factions and functions of an ecosystem are all pretty much the same, city to city. But the way they sort of meld together is different. The value that is created out of them is different. So firstly, we've got a Singapore viewpoint, and I'd like to introduce Grace Tsai. She is the co-founder and CEO of the Hub here in Singapore, which I'm reliably told is the first ever co-working space in Singapore. And there are now how many, Grace?
I would say we were the first big major one.
Okay, first big major one.
Yeah.
Of now there are many. And she's also extremely active in speaking to platforms such as TEDx, advising governments. She's advised the Singapore government, Malaysian government, Angela Merkel in Germany, and she's also on the advisory board for Ben & Jerry's in Singapore, entrepreneur in residence at INSEAD. So thank you for joining us, Grace. And Grace is going to give us a Singapore perspective here. I'd like to welcome Jeremie Kletzkine, and he hails from Israel. And he's the business development manager for Startup Nation Central. And many people here in Singapore will be familiar with what Startup Nation Central is, a fantastic book which was done a few years ago. He's also an entrepreneur, a mentor, and an advisor. And finally, Marco Villa, who splits his time between Milan and Singapore. And now Marco ticks all of those sort of those entrepreneur ecosystem boxes, I think. He's a business angel. He's the co-founder and partner of Italian Angels for Growth. He's an investor. He is the executive director of Italia startup. So a whole range of parts of the ecosystem that Marco covers. So thank you all for joining us today. And so I wanted to start off talking about the sort of the balance in ecosystems. What I've just mentioned, these sort of new initiatives which have developed in entrepreneurial ecosystems that entrepreneurs are using around online networking, around a lot of meetup groups, etc. These are very sort of informal, and I'm interested to know how that fits in with the rest of the ecosystem and what sort of value that it's going to bring. So if we start with Singapore, and let me just touch on a research result which we came out for Singapore. In Singapore, entrepreneurs strongly value the support, more the support of those financial structures, government, other organizations, and less so of the informal communities, but it is changing. And these informal communities are becoming more and more valuable and important. And Grace, perhaps you could talk about what you're doing at the Hub and some of these informal communities and how the organizations like the Hub can take the lead within those communities and what sort of value they're bringing for entrepreneurs.
Sure. So for those of you who are maybe new to this concept, the Hub is a co-working community and space. We have one space right now, 8,000 square feet, but we will be opening our second one in 2 weeks' time in the middle of Somerset. And by year end, we will be around 70,000 square feet. So it's really a growing market and trend for people who want to abandon traditional corporate buildings and offices in order to belong to a community of like-minded people. Now, what is like-minded and how we play a role to complement the wonderful works of people like NUS and IDA is that we are a place of courage. We have built an environment that makes entrepreneurship accessible, right? And then on top of that, very courageous tribe of people who has no judgment and who would encourage you instead of prevent you from pursuing your passion or your dream, as is quite common amongst Asian families, I would say. And on top of that, we have a venture fund that invests in our members. We have an investor program that connects, investor-ready startups to some of the top 10 best VCs in the region. And in every month, we have about 15 to 20 events at the space, right? So if you want to talk about bottom up, about creating a space for the emergence of communities, we definitely believe in that science and the art of that.
Do you think, just building on that and thinking about Singapore, do you think organizations and governments have a role in helping those informal communities and what you've been doing, and to what extent? I mean, it's a tough question, and I will caveat it by saying that the research we found is that entrepreneurs are overwhelmingly positive about the role of governments and corporate organizations in supporting entrepreneurs in Singapore. Some of the people we spoke to said that the Singapore government knocks it out of the park in terms of the level of support they have, but there's got to be a balance, doesn't there?
I think we have to put some caveats and qualifiers there. I just returned from the St. Gallen Symposium yesterday night, and I was with Minister Chan Chun Sing there. He's the minister at the Prime Minister's office, and he was the first speaker at the very high-profile symposium who got an ovation. And that's because in Singapore, the government really has the interest of people at heart as number one, right? Apart from way ahead of personal and their family interests. So I think in Singapore, the government has definitely done a good job in seeding the ecosystem. What I always believe is that if you look at the maturity of an ecosystem as an S-curve, the government has a role in the beginning of it, to seed it, to introduce different paths of success, to influence employers and universities and schools that entrepreneurship is also defined as a successful career and not just being a trader or a banker or a lawyer. And then it should really leave us alone in the middle. It should leave us alone to experiment, to pivot, to make mistakes, to fail, to learn, to relearn. And then it can come in again at the end to celebrate and amplify the success of entrepreneurs, of intermediaries like us. So I would say always to startups that we can work with the government, but with caution, and only if we're strong enough. Not let the government define or prescribe our KPIs, because then you're not an entrepreneur. You are, you are a person who can deal with KPIs and politics, you know. so we really should be strong enough to be free from prescribed KPIs from the government, but work in alignment with them whenever it makes sense.
So each plays a role, and I'm gonna switch to a different part of the world now, and we're gonna talk about Tel Aviv now. And firstly, Tel Aviv was one of the cities that we researched as part of our project, and Tel Aviv is quite unique in quite a few respects. I'm sure you would agree with that. Now, they, out of all the 10 cities we ranked, Tel Aviv was the hardest place to set up a business out of all 10 of those. And they also were the ones that said the government was least effective in helping and supporting entrepreneurs within those cities. So there was very much a picture being painted of Tel Aviv being a different type of place than Singapore. This wanting to be sort of a very entrepreneur-led sort of city of ecosystem. So, Jeremie, maybe you can give us some insight into. You spent some time in Singapore, Tel Aviv. How you think it compares and contrasts?
Yes. So, hi everyone. So you're right. Tel Aviv is a bit specific. Few numbers: 5,300 startups at least, not including the one in the garage. And the first position in the world in terms of number of startups per capita, with 2,000, one startup for 2,000 people. So yes, so the Israelis are by definition informal. So try to bring formality and they will reject it. It's their very nature. So of course the entrepreneurship spirit is the core at of everything in this country. The immigrations, they are entrepreneurs by definition, and the army is also designed around this kind of spirit. So, so definitely, the role that plays the government actually is quite. The government is quite involved, but at the level that it doesn't disturb the business and the companies to operate. So you have all the programs of the incubators. The definition of an incubator and an accelerator in Israel is different from what you find elsewhere. The accelerators, there are almost 100 accelerators in Israel for a country that is quite small. The accelerators are non-profit, and the incubators are programs by the government that are supported. They invest 85% of the money, and 15% is actually local partners in partnership with international partners. So the government puts a lot of money. The chief scientist, it's an entity that depends to the Ministry of Economy, and they are very, very active, and they are doing some great stuff. But the different activities that they are not really touching the business. It's not policies, it's support. And they're trying not to add constraints. So it's always this balance between adding constraints and helping actually the community to grow and giving support.
It sounds it's all about balance. I mean, Grace touched on balances there as well between formal structures within an ecosystem and these more informal. Marco, maybe we can move on to Italy. I'm sad to say that Italy was not, or Milan, where you're from, is not one of the cities which was covered by our research. But interested to know what was going on in Milan. It's quite different to Tel Aviv and to Singapore in terms of its makeup. I mean, Italy's been sort of an innovation hub for a millennium, maybe more. But it's characterized by having lots of small and medium-sized organizations. And how does that sort of work around your own entrepreneurial ecosystem?
Well, the fact that Milan was not one of the 10 cities already kind of tells a lot on the fact that the road is still long. For a country, well, in one way, Italy is very different from places like Singapore or Tel Aviv just because of size. Yeah. So it's also difficult to think of it in terms of cities yet. It's a 60 million country. We have Rome, we have Milan. They're different sizes, but roughly similar in terms of the fact that they are competing to become the innovation hub of the country. And it is an interesting place with an interesting story. As you said, it's been innovating for ages, but until 10 years ago, we were not that much on the map. And a reason being, it's difficult to find a reason really, but in the, or one specific one. For sure, things have changed a lot since I started getting involved as an investor in the ecosystem, in the Italian ecosystem about 10 years ago. I wouldn't say there was nothing going on, but there was very little going on, confused. In the past 10 years, things changed, as they changed in a lot of other countries, to be honest. The interesting bit for maybe our conversation today is that compared to other places, I was thinking about what Grace was saying about the role of the government at the beginning. I'm actually convinced that my observation is in other situations like ours, government was a follower. The movement started from the fact that we needed entrepreneurs. Italian had and still has in part a stagnant economy. So we had to have entrepreneurship, we had to have new companies, new jobs were only going to come from new businesses and not from the old manufacturing one. And sort of a community started growing around this. The first investors, the first angel groups, and at some point the government had to notice. We put pressure on them. They were smart people, they realized it themselves, and finally decided that they had to give a framework, a legislative framework for the ecosystem to grow. So our startup legislation is probably one of the youngest around. It's about 3-4 years old, where they started taking care of things like having a more flexible labor law for people working in startups and a few other bits and pieces. But it's an interesting story because it's probably different from some other places in terms of we didn't have a strong army or defense industry to ask for technology. We didn't have a government that said, okay, we need to create it. It really started from reality. The government had to take notice, and we also have to keep in mind that in the larger country, regional and city governments also play a role. So those that are more dynamics are getting the results. Those that are sort of less dynamics are getting the consequences.
That's interesting, talking about some of the challenges of trying to build up this ecosystem from scratch. You would never really thought of Italy being new in too many respects, but clearly the ecosystem is new and developing. And it leads me to one of the questions which has come through on Pigeonhole, which I'm going to push up here now, which asks about, get the technology working, what are the biggest challenges building startup ecosystems are in your respective countries? And maybe, Grace, I can start with you, because if you don't mind, because you've talked about being a real pioneer in terms of Singapore and your co-working space. What are the challenges you went through?
Well, to start the hub, I was really solving my own problem, because when I was 24, I wanted to start my own company. And it was the closest men around me, not women, the closest men around me, the dad, the boyfriend at that time, that were like, no, be a normal person, don't be crazy, and don't start a company at 24, and be a millionaire like your sister first, then give back, right? I think it was that experience that really was the seed of the hub, to create a place for that is supportive of young people and the pursuit of their dreams and their passion. The challenge is always in leadership and in balancing whether am I building a business or am I building an ecosystem, right? The ecosystem has to be the mission, right? But the vehicle to get there is varied from a community builder to the next. Some people use a co-working space model. Some people use an online community model. Some people use blogs and media and conferences, right? All these are different vehicles. Now, we have chosen a model that is quite difficult to do, because it is, at the end, a real estate thing. So I think from experience, it's really trying to split our time and resources in whether we are building a business or an ecosystem, and it's always that balance. Maintaining neutrality is also important, because leadership in a very informal community is actually more important than leadership in a formal community, And there is a lot of research and book around that. Now, whether that leadership is able to understand different sectors, understand the different motivations and dynamics, power dynamics in the public sector, in the private sector, amongst investors, is really quite a tall order. And in the midst of that, to remain neutral and to be pro-founders and not pro-money at the end of the day.
Jeremie, I'm seeing a lot of nodding from over
No,
there. Nodding to leadership or nodding to being neutral, or?
First of all, yes, I learn a lot, but you know, when I see this question on an Israeli perspective, the answer is so obvious. It's written even bigger than the question. When you are isolated from the rest of the world, when you are surrounded by countries that are, if not hostile, they are not your best friends, and then your first challenge to build an ecosystem locally is you're disconnected from the rest of the world. So I see also Singapore as a small country that also is facing this challenge of how to go international, global from day one. So sometimes you may think that having a local market is an advantage, but the companies that design a product and start to have customers locally, it's much more difficult for them because of the DNA of the money. It's hard to get like additional funding and the change strategy to go global. It just doesn't work. It's very hard. In Israel, the fact that you start from day one, the first step, it's much higher, but once you start, then you're global. So you know, it's almost on the other side. We have a great advantage over many other ecosystems such as Berlin or London or the Silicon Valley. We have a great advantage that we are far and we don't know the needs of the clients and we don't know how to easily reach the markets. How is it an advantage? It's an advantage because when there's no box, then you can easily think outside of the box. It's something that is, in Israel, it's something that helps the companies to be creative. Of course, at a certain step, you're blocked because I'm not even talking about marketing, but even at the product level, the Israelis need to improve. They don't really know the needs, and they start with the technologies. And then they think about what is the best application. And sometimes they don't even start with a sector. They create this big data analytics engine, and they say, okay, what should I do with that? Gaming, fintech, cyber, healthcare. So it's the other way around that enables more creativity, more technology, more innovation. But it's very quickly, you're stuck because you don't have the workforce, you don't have the skill set in order to bring these technologies to the market, and you need partners. You need partners internationally, you need partners that will help you to design your products, and of course, to integrate them to global solutions. So the biggest challenge is being isolated, but it's also how to transform this disadvantage into a culture, DNA.
I think exclusivity is a challenge as well, and I'm bringing that up because it's a fairly loaded statement, because our research came up, and this is a wide piece of research talking to entrepreneurs across 10 cities around the world, and we looked at the split between male entrepreneurs and female entrepreneurs in those cities. Tel Aviv was at the bottom. I think we had 86% male and 14% female. Within that ecosystem. So getting women, getting immigrants, getting other people into that entrepreneurial ecosystem can be a challenge as well. Do you have quickly, how would you deal with that within Israel, in Tel Aviv specifically? Then maybe we can understand from Grace a bit more about Singapore and exclusivity.
You know, the question of women, I think Israel is in a good position. I mean, it's starting with a good environment. We had a female prime minister 50 years ago. It's a country that the army also is putting the women forward, and in the society they are really in a good position. And the problem, I think, is also with the perception of very early, before the school even, of the young people thinking about computers. And I think that the problem is not in the structure at the level of the companies, or even at the level of the army. If you take the intelligence units in the army, the 8200 units, let's say, which is the most famous one, the NSA in Israel, you have 50% of women at the entry. So, but all the men decide to go to the technology units, and all the women decide to go to the analysts. And but it's their choice, and it's something that is. So of course it can be improved. I think that it's more like the fact that the geek is something very positive, very young, and I think it's a cultural problem and not
Interesting.
something beyond that.
Grace or Marco, do you want to add anything to any particular initiatives that you have in your own cities around trying to widen the talent pool, if you like, so to include more men or include more women in this case, and different other types of people?
I'll just make a quick comment. I mean, we are drowned by research that shows that companies with a female founder or a co-founder is more likely going to succeed. And not only that, that's going to give a higher ROI to the investors, right? Now, for any kind of realization to become implemented as a thing, sometimes it takes 2 to 3 generations, right? So times it with 40 years each. And so we are seeing that's an unfortunate situation that in most tech incubators, the ratio of male to female is 9:1. At the hub, it's 1:1, and
That's
I can
high,
try to explain why. But it's an unfortunate thing, but we really are seeing a shift in that. And I think perhaps we should also expand who we serve. We serve tech startups, but perhaps we can also serve other types of startups that are perhaps more attractive for women, tech-enabled as well. At the hub, we really attract who we are. My whole team was women. Until we really were hard in finding Prashant, who is a male. And we really needed to work really hard hiring men, because it was really a rare skill set that we're looking for. And because we are quite broad in how we define a startup ecosystem, that we have 50% female and 50% male. We have 41 nationalities in our community, so it's pretty diverse. And I think if you ask any member of the hub, they would say they really enjoy the diversity.
Thank you.
So we don't have data because we're not one of your 10 cities, but we have observations that we can make. It certainly when there's diversity, gender diversity in the founders team, the observation is getting founded is easier because generally speaking, the balance gets perceived by investors. I'm not really aware of any specific initiatives that go in that direction. But having worked with founders and investors, there is also something to say about the investor part of the equation, and there's still a tiny minority of, at least in most of Europe, I think only now 8 to 9% of business angels are actually women. So 90% are still men. So we need to work on both sides, which actually brings me back to the original question, which was the one about the challenges that the different ecosystems are facing. One of the challenges would be, since we are also touching upon the role of government, one of the challenges would be how do we direct more private money to the startup ecosystems, because one of the challenges that we have, for instance, is, well, we don't really have a lot of corporate buyers, but we also don't have a lot of funding available in terms of VCs and so on and so forth. So a few ecosystems like the UK managed to redirect a lot of personal savings and making investing in startups a lot more normal than just something that the lucky few or those who are informed can do. They made it available to some tax incentives to a larger percentage of the population, and the result is showing. I mean, the UK is investing in startups more than any other European countries, because when you move to sort of more mature markets, and I'm thinking of Europe in this case, these are all countries with very high debt. They cannot basically afford the kind of financial support that maybe, for what I understand, it can be possible in Singapore. So they need to, but at the same time, their population have a higher saving rate. So if we manage to find a way to move some of that money from real estate to startups, there would be one less challenge to talk about maybe next time we meet.
I mean, funding, it's always good to talk about funding and money. It is the #1 challenge for all startups. I'm sure the entrepreneurs out here would agree with that. That's probably a whole session in its own right. So I won't focus too much on funding now, but what I do want to talk about is about networking next, which is one of the key things which happens within these ecosystems. And one of the most revealing findings from the research we did was that the entrepreneurs who network the most are the most successful. So that's a really interesting finding. If you network the most, you are the most successful, and most successful in terms of better revenue growth than your competitors, better profitability than your competitors, better access to talent. So really important stuff for all startup businesses and entrepreneurs. So clear link between that networking and those business benefits. And so that's interesting. Would you agree, Grace? If I pass to you, would you agree with that? That, I mean, this is indicating that the more you network, the better you're going to be. Is it as easy as that?
I would reframe the equation, right? Because we're also very wary of founders that are in every conference and is just a super networker, but it's not really building the business. I would reframe it to, I think founders and entrepreneurs who are making an effort to meet the people they should be meeting, those are good ones. Because at the end of the day, we really learn from the mentors that we surround ourselves by. We learn from the other serial entrepreneurs, the more experienced entrepreneurs that we can tap into and get a glimpse of the horizon that we will embark on. And those are very intentional curation of connections, right? So internally in my team, we measure success by what we call the bump rate. So are we creating the right environment for our members to bump into the right people? Who could be their next co-founder, who could be their next team member or their next investor. And we measure these connections made. And out of the 50-20 events at the hub, 1/3 of them are what we call speed dating, matchmaking kind of events between and amongst founders, but also increasingly, what we realize is that founders don't need more money. What they need is more customers. And we're in a capital where 75% of the Fortune 500 HQs are in Singapore, right? And so we are also now curating programs where corporates are placed in front of founders that are ready to scale through a global distribution network. So it really takes knowing what founders need and also the trends on a macro level to create such environments. But we do measure ourselves to that.
We're talking networking. Jeremie, we were talking earlier about Tel Aviv, and you suggested there's sort of a tier of
yes.
level within Tel Aviv and sort of a barrier where the lower people down in the ecosystem can't access the higher people up. Is that?
Yes, Tel Aviv is also a small ecosystem, and everybody knows everyone, and it's the high-tech industry in Israel. The whole high-tech industry is 250,000 people. This is what it is. So when you need to access specific people, you're 1 degree away. However, the way it's structured, the tier 1 investors, they get all the big deals and the best deals first. Because the best entrepreneurs, the ones who are experienced and they know what they do, they are knocking at their doors first. And the rest of the investors, they get the rest, the ones that were not. So there are still opportunities and there are still good things to do, but the way it is structured in Israel, it's still elitist, So the networking environment is very vibrant. You have a lot of events, meetups all the time. You have a lot of communities that are spontaneous communities, and people belong to 3, 4, 5 different groups when they have startups, and you have a lot of platforms, big platforms, small platforms, helping a lot. The accelerators, there are many different accelerators. They are very open, so they make a lot of interaction between the portfolio companies and the rest of the community all the time. So you bump into the same people all the time in the events. So networking is one thing, but selecting and getting access to the right people, you first need to gain the credibility in order to get their attention.
Marco, what about in Italy? We again, sorry, it's not part of our research.
No, that's okay. No,
we believe you.
We learned that, well, yeah, okay. I'm not surprised by the results. I mean, in a way, saying that networking is crucial in the success of any on any enterprise that is creative. It's almost like a truism, but it's interesting how people do it. As we observe, I mean, observing ecosystems around the world, what I notice is that we are looking at a couple of examples of how important physical places are in terms of networking. So one could be like co-working spaces, but the one couple of examples that I can quickly present are, well, in Milan, for instance, somebody that is an entrepreneur that actually had a real estate idea, but with a flair that was, I want to bring everyone in the ecosystem in the same building, or as many as I can get. And he pestered anyone, like everyone he knew, for about 3 years, and he succeeded. For them, it's probably more of a real estate business, but the reality is it worked. It's not a co-working space, it's a lot of people having different spaces, but with a lot of common areas. So if I have to, we are in Singapore, so a lot of people can easily relate to Block 71. So compared to Block 71, that doesn't have a lot of common areas, or at least that I could experience. This one is called Copernico from the name of the street, has a lot of common areas. So you might have your own office, but every time you go for lunch, you go downstairs for a conference call, you go to the toilet, you meet an investor, an entrepreneur, someone else. And same system worked or in San Antonio, Texas, just not to talk just about the Silicon Valley, but smaller cities. I've been there for other reasons, and they have the same. Someone that had a building in the center and said, I want everybody to be here. And they managed. And at the beginning, I was skeptical because I was like, well, this guy only wants to make money, and maybe he will, good for him, but it's actually working. That people actually do meet, and I can see the difference it's making in the city ecosystem to have one place where everybody, or most people, no, not everybody, but a lot of people really are.
Getting everybody in the building is clearly a challenge that leads beautifully into a question we have here from the audience. I think I'm going to give this one to Grace. I'll just put it up on the screen. And it says, there are many demo days taking place, but investors, VCs, are not showing up. Something seems to be broken. Do you agree? What needs to be done to get VCs to make time for the startups? I mean, I'm sure startups within the hub are having a lot of these sorts of challenges. Do you want to respond to that one, Grace?
I don't agree with that statement.
No?
Usually, if you're a qualified, legitimate incubator, your demo days will be attended by at least 100 investors or VC funds. So I don't know who this person is referring to. But in general, though, the format of accelerators and incubators is also to be challenged. So perhaps there is some truth in this, and perhaps the answer could be that maybe VCs and investors perhaps have lost trust or faith in a 100-day model for 10 to 12 startups. Okay, yeah. Because arguably we are seeing greater ROIs and exits for a model that is completely opposite, which is incubate 2 to 3 companies for 1 to 2 years. So there is a little bit of a herd mentality going on in the accelerator incubator space. I saw also a question around that. Yep. There's so many, like someone said that Singapore is over-incubated, right? Like there's just too many accelerators and incubators, but they haven't innovated on the format itself, on the theory of change that hasn't been innovated. So I would really challenge, incubators and accelerators leaders to kind of challenge the format.
There's another question here, which I think we've run out of time. We don't quite have time to answer, but it was around this competition amongst incubators within Asia, and how do they actually differentiate themselves? Because it's very much a sort of cookie-cutter approach, a little bit at the moment, and not enough startups to go around, not enough differentiation. We are out of time. I want to thank you all for staying here. And talking about networking, there is a great networking event, so I'm told straight after this, which is the, basically a pub crawl, which is around Club Street area. And I think it's a good combination of sort of informal innovation with support from governments and organizations, because governments and organizations create the platform, they're creating the bar space, bringing entrepreneurs together to have these informal contacts and networking. So hope you all get along to that. I might see some of you at that later. Last point, if you want to see some of this research, it is online. You can see it at eiuperspectives.economist.com. Google EIU Perspectives, you will find it there. But thank you very much for your time. Let me thank our panel for joining us today, and thank you.
Thanks.